The Second World War created heroes in places no one expected. Among them were women who never fired a weapon, yet flew straight into the jaws of danger. They took control of brand-new Spitfires, Hurricanes, and even massive Lancasters, delivering them from factories to the front lines with nothing more than a compass, a paper map, and their instincts. They had no radios, no escorts, no protection. Every flight was a gamble against storms, engine failures, unfamiliar cockpits, and the unforgiving English sky. And in the middle of that silent battle was one name whispered like a legend: Mary Ellis, a woman who survived more than 1,000 flights, guiding war machines through cold skies filled with risk, doubt, and the constant shadow of death. This is not a story about combat. This is the story of the women who flew into danger so others could fight. The forgotten pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ones who never went to war yet paid its price. War changes everything, even the sky. Before the world knew her name, Mary Ellis stood at the edge of an airfield in southern England, watching the silhouette of a Spitfire cutting across the clouds like a blade. She was 22, small, quiet, almost delicate in appearance. The kind of woman people assumed belonged behind a desk, not in a cockpit. Yet something in her eyes betrayed the stillness of her posture. A hunger, a calling, or perhaps simply the stubborn refusal to let a war decide what she could or could not do. England in 1941 was a place of trembling nights and smoke-stained mornings. Cities still smoldered from the Blitz. The sky vibrated with the hum of engines, some friendly, most not. The Air Transport Auxiliary, the organization that would define Mary's life, was still young and misunderstood. To most, it was a group of civilians ferrying military aircraft from factories to air bases. To the men fighting at the front line, it was a miracle that made planes appear when they were needed most. But to many others, it was a reckless gamble. Civilians flying combat aircraft with minimal training, women stepping into machines designed for war. The idea unsettled people more than the war itself. Mary felt that fear too, though she never admitted it. She felt it in the quiet moments before takeoff, when her fingers tightened around her flight helmet. She felt it when she saw crews pulling the charred remains of a crashed aircraft from a nearby field. The ATA lost pilots every week, not to enemy fire, but to weather, mechanical failures, and the brutal truth that the sky had no patience for mistakes. But fear didn't stop her. It sharpened her. Her first days at the ATA were a trial by fire. The training was quick, almost shockingly so. They were taught the basics of instrument reading, navigation, takeoff, landing, and emergency procedures. But there was no luxury of repetition. The war didn't wait. The factories were producing aircraft faster than anyone could deliver them. Pilots were desperately needed, and the ATA filled that gap with whoever could fly. Mary could fly. She always could. Now she had to prove she could survive. At the training airfield, a senior instructor handed her a stack of manuals, each one thick with diagrams and technical jargon. He dropped them into her arms with a grunt that wasn't quite disapproval, but not quite respect either. "You'll need these," he said. "We don't have time to walk you through every cockpit. You study, you memorize, you fly. Make sure you know where everything is before you touch it. The war won't forgive a wrong switch." Mary nodded, though inside she felt the weight of what he didn't say. There were dozens of aircraft models she would be expected to fly. Trainers, bombers, fighters, some she had never even seen up close. There would be no transition training, no gentle introduction. The reality was brutal. She would climb into each new cockpit alone and work it out in the air. Many pilots died figuring it out. The manuals became her constant companions. She read them in the mess hall, in her bunk, under dim lamps during blackout nights. Her mind absorbed every gauge, every lever, every quirk of each aircraft. The Spitfire, The Hurricane, the Oxford, the Barracuda. Machines with personalities as complex as people, each demanding its own kind of respect. She memorized them like secrets whispered in the dark. Her first assignment came sooner than expected. A humble, yellow-painted trainer aircraft called the Tiger Moth. Most pilots dismissed it as nothing more than a toy. Slow, fragile, exposed. But to Mary, it was the doorway to everything that came after. If she could prove herself in that little biplane, she would earn the trust to fly the war machines she dreamed of. The morning of her first official ATA flight was cold enough to numb her fingers. Frost clung to the grass, and a pale sun struggled to warm the world. A thin mist hovered over the field, turning the runway into a ghostly strip of white. Mary pulled on her gloves and stepped toward the aircraft. Her breath came out in soft clouds. The Tiger Moth waited for her, its fabric wings trembling slightly in the wind. A mechanic stood beside it, arms crossed, watching her approach. When he realized she was the pilot, his eyebrows lifted in disbelief. "You're flying her?" he said, as if the idea offended the laws of nature. Mary didn't answer. She didn't need to. She climbed into the cockpit, adjusted her straps, and began her checks. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. She heard him mutter under his breath, "Bloody hell. They're letting girls fly now." The words tightened something in her chest, but she forced herself not to react. She had heard worse. Women didn't belong in cockpits, they said. Women weren't built for war. Women would panic. Women would crash. The sky was no place for them. Mary's answer to all of it was simple. She would fly anyway. And she would survive. The engine sputtered to life, the propeller cutting thin circles into the cold air. Mary felt the familiar vibration through her seat, a rhythm that steadied her heartbeat. She glanced once at the horizon, a flat line blending into the mist, and then eased the throttle forward. The Tiger Moth rolled, gained speed, and lifted gently into the morning sky. The first sensation was freedom, a freedom so complete that it washed away everything else. The doubts, the whispers, the fear. Up there, she wasn't a woman. She wasn't a civilian. She wasn't an outsider. She was a pilot. The sky didn't care about her gender. It only cared about her skill. She climbed higher, cutting through the clouds, until the world below disappeared. The engine hummed beneath her, and the wind wrapped around the open cockpit like ice. She felt alive. Terrifyingly alive. But that moment didn't last long. On her first descent into the receiving airfield, a sudden gust slammed into the side of the plane. The Tiger Moth lurched violently, throwing Mary sideways. Her heart jolted. Instinct kicked in. She corrected the bank, leveled the wings, and breathed through the adrenaline. The landing came fast, the wheels hitting the runway harder than she intended. The aircraft bounced once, twice, before settling. When she climbed out, her legs shook slightly. But she smiled. She had done it. Her first delivery. Her first official contribution to the war effort. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She expected congratulations. Instead, she found silence. A group of male pilots stood nearby, watching her as though she had trespassed somewhere sacred. One of them approached her with an expression that was almost pitying. "Brave girl," he said, patting the wing. "But be careful. These machines aren't for delicate hands." Mary looked at him. Her voice was quiet, almost serene. "Delicate hands have their purpose too. Mine just happen to fly airplanes." He blinked, unsure how to respond. Over the next weeks, she flew more. Trainers at first, then light transports. Her confidence grew with every successful landing. But so did the weight of responsibility. Word spread quickly across ATA bases. Mary Ellis could fly. Really fly. Before long, her name appeared on the assignment board next to something new. Something dangerous. Something she had dreamed about since she first saw one slice through the clouds. A supermarine Spitfire. The thought alone sent a shiver down her spine. It was beautiful, deadly, and notoriously difficult. Many pilots compared it to a wild horse. If you respected it, it would carry you. If you hesitated, it would kill you. Her hands shook slightly as she approached the aircraft for the first time. Its dark green and gray camouflage gleamed under the muted light. The smell of fuel and hot metal clung to the air. This was no trainer. This was a machine built for war. A ground crewman handed her a clipboard to sign, his expression doubtful. "First time in a Spitfire?" he asked. She nodded. He hesitated. "Take it slow. She bites." Mary climbed into the cockpit. It felt like slipping into another world. Everything was tighter, sharper, more unforgiving. She scanned the instruments, recalling every page she had studied. She whispered each step under her breath. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. The engine roared to life. A deeper, more powerful sound than anything she had felt before. The aircraft vibrated like a living creature, straining against its restraints. Mary swallowed hard. She eased the throttle. The Spitfire surged forward with a force that pressed her into her seat. The runway blurred. The horizon tilted. And then, suddenly, impossibly, she was flying. The Spitfire responded to her touch like it could read her thoughts. Every movement was sharp, immediate, exhilarating. Mary felt tears sting her eyes from the sheer intensity of it. She was no longer fighting the wind, she was slicing through it. But the Spitfire had one more lesson for her. As she approached the receiving airfield, clouds rolled in like an ambush. The sky darkened. Rain hammered the canopy. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Panic clawed at her, but she forced her breathing to slow. Trust the instruments. Trust your training. Trust yourself. She descended carefully through the murk, feeling the plane buck against the wind. Her heart pounded. Then the runway lights flickered into view. Relief washed through her. She guided the aircraft down, wheels kissing the wet surface with surprising grace. When she stepped out, soaked and trembling, a senior officer approached her. His expression was unreadable. "You just flew in weather that grounded experienced fighter pilots?" he said. "How does it feel?" Mary met his eyes. "It feels like I can do more." He nodded slowly, almost respectfully. "And you will." She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The sky would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. The Spitfire would not be the last machine to try to kill her, and the war would demand everything she had, including parts of herself she didn't know existed. But for now, on that rain-soaked runway, Mary Ellis tasted something she would chase for the rest of her life: freedom, danger, purpose, and the silent promise that she would return to the sky again. Mary Ellis soon discovered that surviving one Spitfire flight didn't earn her admiration, it earned her suspicion. The more she flew, the more she felt the weight of eyes on her. Some watched with disbelief, others with condescension, and a few with the quiet hope that she would fail so the world could return to the way it had always been. A world where women stayed on the ground. But Mary didn't stay on the ground. She flew. Again and again. Each morning, she woke to the sound of distant engines. Each night, she fell asleep to the thrum of machines still echoing in her bones. The ATA needed every pilot it could get, and Mary quickly moved from small trainers to fighters, from fighters to twin-engine beasts, and then to the machines pilots whispered about, with equal parts awe and dread. The war did not slow down. Factories produced faster. The RAF demanded more, and the ATA became the invisible thread stitching together the British Air Forces. Every plane that arrived ready for war had passed through the hands of a pilot like Mary, a pilot who never held a weapon, yet risked as much as anyone who did. With every new aircraft came a new challenge. The ATA's method was brutal. No transition training, no test flights, no co-pilots. They gave you a manual, a checklist, a destination, and a machine you had never touched before. You climbed in, prayed you understood the layout, and took off. Mary kept notebooks filled with scribbles, quick sketches of cockpits, notes about odd levers, warnings written in barely readable handwriting. She studied them like a student studying for an exam where failure meant death. Her world became a blur of airfields. She memorized runways by the number of trees at their edges, the shape of the hangars, the smell of the surrounding countryside. Some runways were so short she felt a knot in her stomach before every landing. Others were muddy strips carved out between hedgerows, barely wide enough for the aircraft they demanded her to ferry. She never complained, not even when the weather turned against her. Bad weather was the great enemy of the ATA. Rain swallowed visibility, fog erased the horizon, and wind tore at wings with violent unpredictability. Pilots had no radios. They couldn't call for help. They couldn't ask for instructions. Once they were in the sky, they were alone, completely alone, trapped in a thin shell of aluminum and hope. One afternoon, Mary received an assignment that made her hesitate. A Barracuda, a carrier-based torpedo bomber, notorious for its strange handling and heavy frame. Rumor said even seasoned naval pilots disliked it. The ground crew exchanged nervous glances when they saw her approaching. "You sure about this?" one of them asked. The last bloke nearly ground-looped it straight into the hangar. Mary nodded. If she refused, she knew exactly what the whispers would be. Women. Pilots. Can't trust them with real aircraft. Better leave the dangerous machines to the men. She climbed in. The cockpit felt cramped, almost hostile. She studied her notes, inhaled deeply, and taxied forward. On takeoff, the Barracuda lurched violently, nearly dragging to one side. She forced the rudder, steadying it. Her jaw tightened. Once in the sky, the plane felt like a stubborn animal fighting beneath her grip. The controls were heavy, unresponsive, unpredictable. Halfway to her destination, clouds swallowed the sky. Rain smacked the canopy, and lightning crackled across the horizon. She descended lower, scanning for breaks in the weather. But the landscape below had vanished into swirling gray. The Barracuda dipped suddenly as a downdraft hit. Mary gritted her teeth, steadying the machine with all her strength. Her arms burned. Sweat slid down her back. She whispered to herself, "Steady now, steady." For a moment, she thought she wouldn't make it. But then, like a curtain pulling back, the airfield appeared below through a thin slit in the storm. She descended sharply, fighting the wind until the wheels slammed onto the runway. The landing was rough, but she was alive. A naval officer approached her as she climbed out. His eyes widened as he realized who had been flying. "Good God, you flew that thing through this weather?" he asked. Mary removed her gloves, trying to hide the slight tremble in her fingers. Yes. It needed delivering. He stared at her as if reassessing everything he knew. For a moment, respect flickered in his expression. Then he nodded once. "Right. Well done." That night, Mary lay in her bunk, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Her muscles ached. Her mind replayed every second of the storm. She wondered how many more times she would be expected to face death with nothing but instinct and a few pages of notes. But she also knew the answer didn't matter. She would keep flying. The war wasn't over. And the air needed her. The next weeks brought new challenges. With every flight she completed, the assignments grew riskier. She ferried aircraft with partial fuel tanks because the factories rationed supplies. She flew without heaters in midwinter, numbness creeping into her bones as she struggled not to black out from the cold. She delivered planes with engines still warm from testing, the vibration shaking her teeth. Sometimes, she flew aircraft so new they still smelled of paint. Sometimes, She flew aircraft so old they rattled like skeletons. A few had bullet holes patched over. A few had engines that made unsettling noises she tried desperately to ignore. But worse than the machines were the losses. Every week, an empty bed appeared in the women's barracks. A pilot who didn't return. A pilot who vanished over the sea or crashed into a hillside lost in fog. The ATA's casualty rate grew, yet the world barely noticed. They weren't combat pilots. They didn't fight. They didn't shoot down enemies or defend cities. They simply delivered the machines that others would use. To Mary, the distinction felt absurd. A death in the sky was still a death. One morning, she saw a mechanic silently scrubbing burnt oil from a piece of mangled metal. The remnants of a crashed aircraft. He avoided her gaze. She recognized the registration number. It belonged to Ruth, a cheerful pilot who had shared stories at dinner only 2 nights before. The realization struck like a physical blow. Ruth had flown into fog, misjudged her altitude, and hit a ridgeline. There was nothing left. Mary felt the world tilt. She sat on a crate, staring into the gray morning air. The sky that gave her freedom could take it away without warning. She felt something cold settle inside her. Not fear. Not yet. But something heavier. The beginning of grief. Still, she flew again the next day. Her determination didn't go unnoticed. Commanders began to trust her with missions others avoided. She ferried aircraft across long distances. She flew into airfields where the smell of smoke and fuel lingered from recent attacks. She flew through storms so violent that even RAF pilots refused to take off. Word spread quietly among the men. They don't fear death, someone said. They've got nothing to prove. Others responded with bitterness, accusing the ATA of risking valuable aircraft by letting women fly them. Someone even joked that Mary Ellis would one day crash a bomber into the ocean and only then realize war wasn't for her. She ignored all of it. The sky had become her teacher, and every flight was a lesson carved into memory. She learned how the engine should sound when it was healthy, and how it changed when trouble was coming. She learned how a plane felt moments before a stall. She learned how to read the clouds like a map, sensing danger before seeing it. But there were moments that tested her beyond skill. One evening, she was assigned a Hurricane with a barely legible note attached to its wing. Caution. Right brake weak. The mechanic shrugged when she asked. It should be fine, he said. Just go easy on landing. Fine wasn't reassuring, but the aircraft had to move, and she was the pilot available. She took off. The flight itself was smooth, but landing revealed the truth. As the wheels touched down, the aircraft pulled violently to the right. She fought the rudder with everything she had, heart pounding, teeth clenched. The Hurricane veered toward the edge of the runway, wheels screeching, mud flying. With a final desperate yank, she brought it to a stop inches before the ditch. Her breath came in gasps. Her legs shook. Someone ran out to check on her. Astonished, she had kept the plane upright. That was close, he said. Too close. By midnight, fatigue crushed her like an invisible weight. She stared at the ceiling of her barracks, listening to the wind howl outside. She wondered if the sky would one day claim her too. The thought lingered in the dark, but something deeper pushed back, a quiet voice within her. You're not done. Not yet. Mary awoke the next morning to another assignment. Not a fighter. Not a trainer. A bomber. A twin-engine Oxford, heavier than anything she had flown alone. The aircraft stood on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, cold and indifferent. Mary approached it with a mixture of awe and dread. Bombers were unforgiving. They demanded strength, patience, and absolute precision. Any mistake became fatal very quickly. She climbed into the cockpit and felt swallowed by its size. The instruments seemed endless. The engines growled to life, shaking the plane violently. Mary steadied her breathing. reviewing her notes once more. Then she pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft lumbered down the runway, slowly gaining speed. The ground trembled beneath it. Mary gripped the controls hard, heart racing. At the last moment, the bomber lifted, climbing with agonizing sluggishness. In the air, she felt the weight of the machine pressing down on her. Every adjustment required more force than she expected. It felt as if the aircraft resented her presence, resisting her every move. She stayed focused, inch by inch, correcting its stubborn tendencies. The flight was long, but uneventful until the engines coughed. A chill ran through her. She scanned the gauges. The left engine temperature spiked. She muttered a prayer. The engine sputtered again. She adjusted the mixture, coaxing it back to life. For a minute, the aircraft seemed content. Then the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in, thick and heavy. Rain lashed the bomber, pounding like fists on metal. Visibility dropped. Turbulence rocked the fuselage. Mary fought the controls, gritting her teeth as the bomber dipped and swayed. She saw nothing outside. No ground. No horizon. Only a swirling void. For a moment, she felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. But she continued. One correction at a time. One breath at a time. Slowly, the bomber descended out of the cloud layer. The shimmering outline of the airfield appeared below. Mary guided the machine down, her arms trembling with exhaustion. The landing was rough, but controlled. When she climbed out, the receiving officer stared at her with disbelief. "You flew through that storm with one engine acting up?" he asked. Mary wiped the rain from her face. It needed delivering. He shook his head, almost laughing from shock. "You ATA pilots, you're either fearless or mad." Mary didn't answer. She didn't know the answer herself. That night, as she hung her wet flight suit to dry, she thought of Ruth again. Of all the pilots who didn't return. She wondered why she survived when so many didn't. The sky, she realized, was choosing, testing, judging, and it would test her again. Because soon, Mary Ellis would face the flight that changed everything. The flight that nearly ended her story before it truly began. By 1943, Mary Ellis had flown so many aircraft that even the mechanics struggled to keep count. Every week brought new machines, new risks, new whispers that the women of the ATA were pushing too far, flying too boldly, surviving too long. The public still didn't know their names. Newspapers wrote about aces and dogfights, not the silent ferry flights that moved the war forward one aircraft at a time. Mary didn't mind the silence, but she felt the weight of it. The world looked away from the people who flew the planes no one else wanted to touch. The airfields were changing too. Bomb craters dotted the countryside. Air raid sirens became a familiar soundtrack. Pilots drank tea alongside hangars patched with sheet metal after night raids. Every morning, Mary found another clue that the war was accelerating. More aircraft, more urgent schedules, more fatigue settling into the bones of the ATA pilots. She had become one of the most reliable flyers, a name commanders scribbled immediately when a difficult plane needed moving. Some pilots envied her, many admired her. A few feared for her. One cold dawn, she received a delivery order that made her pause. A twin-engine Wellington bomber. Larger than anything she had flown alone, heavier, slower to respond, and notorious for its quirks. The aircraft stood at the far end of the tarmac like a slumbering giant, its dark fuselage glistening with dew. Two mechanics inspected it with grim faces. "Is she airworthy?" Mary asked. "Airworthy enough," one replied. "But keep in mind, she's had some engine trouble. The left one runs a bit rough." Mary felt a small knot form in her stomach. That wasn't comforting. But she nodded anyway. The war didn't wait for perfect planes. It barely waited for functional ones. As she climbed the ladder into the cockpit, the cold seeped into her gloves. The pilot's seat felt too large, the controls too spread out. She moved her hands across the panels, memorizing every switch she had studied the night before. The smell of oil and damp fabric filled the air. She inhaled slowly, steadying her nerves. When the engines roared to life, the entire aircraft shuddered. The left engine coughed twice before stabilizing. Mary didn't like the sound, but it was too late to turn back. She taxied forward, feeling the bomber's reluctance with every movement. It wanted more runway, more time, more strength. The takeoff roll felt endless. The bomber crawled forward, gaining speed slowly, almost painfully. Mary pushed the throttles harder. The runway blurred. The engines groaned. At the last possible moment, the Wellington lifted, heavy and ungraceful, as though unwilling to leave the ground. Mary exhaled in relief. For the first 20 minutes, the flight was calm. Cold sunlight filtered through broken clouds. Below, England stretched out like a patchwork quilt. Fields, forests, rivers glinting in pale light. Mary glanced at her compass, adjusting course. She settled into a rhythm, listening to the engine's uneven harmony. Then she heard it. A faint change in pitch. A subtle rattle. The left engine stuttered again. She checked the gauges. Oil pressure dipped for a moment before rising. Temperature fluctuated. A warning trembled at the edge of her instincts. She made small adjustments, hoping it would stabilize. But the engine grew louder, rougher. The bomber vibrated slightly. Mary gripped the controls tighter. Not now. Not here. She considered turning back, but clouds were rolling in behind her. The weather was shifting too fast. Returning meant flying into a storm forming over the coast. Forward was the only option. She swallowed her fear and steadied her breathing. Minutes later, the world exploded. The left engine backfired with a thunderous crack. Flames burst from the exhaust stack, flaring bright against the morning sky. The entire aircraft lurched left, dropping altitude rapidly. Mary's heart slammed in her chest. She shouted inside her mind, "Focus." She cut the throttle to the failing engine, reducing power to stop the fire. The flame died, but the bomber continued to yaw violently. She pushed the right throttle forward, countering the pull. Her muscles strained. Sweat broke across her forehead despite the cold. The Wellington shuddered, losing more altitude. Mary scanned for a field, a clearing, anything. But below her lay forests, villages, patches of frozen earth, nowhere to land safely, nowhere at all. She forced the bomber to level, inch by inch, fighting the imbalance. Her right arm ached. Her breath came in quick bursts. The controls felt heavier with every passing second. She whispered, "Hold together. Just hold." A strong crosswind hit suddenly, slamming the bomber sideways. The aircraft banked sharply. The horizon disappeared. For a terrifying second, Mary felt the nose dip, as though the bomber intended to roll onto its side. Her hand shot to the rudder trim. Her foot pressed down hard. Every muscle in her body strained against the motion. The bomber groaned, metal creaking under the stress. Slowly, painfully, the plane obeyed. She leveled it again, heart pounding like a drum. Her destination airfield lay still 40 miles away. The bomber couldn't make that distance on one engine. Not in this weather. She needed to land now. Mary scanned desperately until she spotted a strip of land, a long rectangle carved between two farms. It wasn't an airfield. It wasn't even flat. But it was the only chance she had. She descended, praying the bomber wouldn't stall. The right engine roared at maximum power, shaking the cockpit violently. The landscape grew larger, clearer, more terrifying. Fence, trees, uneven ground. She lined up as best she could. The bomber drifted left, almost uncontrollably. Mary corrected, forcing the aircraft straight. Her arms felt like lead, her vision blurred at the edges. Then the wheels touched down. A bone-rattling impact surged through the fuselage. The bomber bounced once, twice, then skidded across the rough ground. Mud sprayed against the canopy. The plane swerved dangerously as the right engine pulled harder than the dead left. Mary cut power. The bomber slid, plowed through brittle winter grass, then finally jolted to a halt just yards from a stone wall. Silence fell. Mary's breath trembled. She couldn't move. For a long moment, she simply stared straight ahead, hands frozen around the controls. Her mind replayed the last terrifying minutes in sharp flashes. The engine fire, the violent descent, the impossible landing. She was alive. Barely. Voices shouted outside. A group of farm workers ran toward the bomber, waving frantically. One of them banged on the side of the fuselage. "Are you all right in there?" Mary blinked, finally releasing the controls. Her fingers were numb. She opened the canopy and climbed out, legs unsteady. The cold air hit her like a slap. A man stared at her in disbelief. "You flew that thing? Alone?" She nodded weakly. "Madness," he muttered. "Pure madness." A few hours later, an RAF recovery crew arrived. Officers inspected the bomber, shaking their heads at the damaged engine. One turned to Mary. "You saved an aircraft that should have crashed 20 miles back," he said. "How'd you manage that?" Mary didn't know how to answer. She didn't feel brave, or skilled, or extraordinary. She felt empty, drained, as though part of her had been left behind in the sky. When they drove her back to base, the world felt strangely muted. The hum of the truck engine, the murmur of the soldiers, the passing fields, everything blurred into a distant haze. She sat quietly, staring out the window, replaying the moment the engine burst into flames. What if she hadn't reacted in time? What if she had panicked? What if? The thoughts gnawed at her. Back at the ATA barracks, the women waited for her. Word had spread quickly. Flyers always knew when someone had nearly died. They knew by the way footsteps dragged. By the way, a pilot's eyes looked slightly older. One of the senior women placed a cup of tea in Mary's hands. No words were needed. Shared silence was enough. That night, Mary didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring into darkness. The image of the burning engine returned again and again. The terror, the cold grip of helplessness, the realization of how close she had come. Morning arrived with a thin layer of frost coating the windows. Mary rose slowly, feeling every muscle ache. She walked to the assignment board, unsure what she expected to find. There it was. Her name. Another aircraft. Another destination. Another test. She stared at it for a long moment. A wave of nausea pooled in her stomach. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the slip of paper. A voice spoke behind her. "You don't have to fly today, Miss Ellis." Mary turned. It was the base commander, a stern man with tired eyes. He studied her face quietly. "Most pilots would take a few days after what you went through," he said gently. "No shame in that. No shame at all." Mary lowered her gaze. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. The thought of stepping back into a cockpit twisted something in her chest. But deeper still was another feeling. Something quiet. Something stubborn. Something that told her the sky would not be her enemy. Not today. She folded the assignment order. "I'll fly," she said. The commander sighed. "I thought you'd say that." Mary walked toward the hangar, wrapped her scarf tightly, and inhaled the cold morning air. Her boots crunched across the frost-covered ground. The aircraft waiting for her today was a small trainer. Nothing compared to the bomber that nearly killed her. But when she climbed in, fear curled inside her like smoke. Her hands shook when she touched the throttle. For the first time, the cockpit felt claustrophobic. The sky felt hostile. She closed her eyes. Breathe. One breath. Then another. She reminded herself of every flight she had mastered. Every storm she survived. Every insult she ignored. Every machine she learned to control. She belonged here. The trainer's engine sputtered to life. The propeller spun. The aircraft rolled forward. As the little plane lifted from the runway, something inside her loosened. The tightness in her chest eased. The fear drifted away with the wind. She was flying again. Not perfectly. Not fearlessly. But she was flying. For the next hour, she performed simple maneuvers above the countryside, banking gently, climbing, descending. Nothing dangerous, nothing heroic, just the familiar rhythm of flight. When she landed, there was no applause, no praise, no ceremony, just the soft crunch of tires meeting earth. But Mary smiled to herself. She had returned to the sky, and though she didn't yet know it, her greatest test was approaching. A mission that would bring her face to face with the most feared aircraft in Britain's arsenal, the Lancaster. A machine so enormous, so powerful, so unforgiving that even seasoned bomber crews treated it with reverence. Soon, Mary Ellis would sit in its cockpit, and the sky would judge her once more. The first time Mary Ellis saw Lancaster up close, she felt dwarfed by its presence. It loomed over the tarmac like a steel cathedral. Its 4 massive engines lined beneath wings that stretched wider than the farmhouse she grew up in. Even without bombs in its belly, the aircraft radiated a heavy, solemn authority. This was the machine that carried crews deep into enemy territory and brought far too many back as smoke and twisted metal. It was not meant for one pilot, especially not a pilot flying alone. An officer approached as she stared up at the bomber. His expression held a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "This one's yours today, Miss Ellis. Ferry it to Waddington. Weather's clear for now, but fog is expected. Best depart quickly." Mary nodded, though her stomach tightened. She glanced at the engines again. 4. Twice as many as she had ever managed on her own. Twice the weight, twice the complexity. 4 times the potential for disaster. She knew the Lancaster only from thick manuals and stories shared over cold dinners. Stories of tail-heavy climbs, slow response times, and the way the engines pulled against one another if not handled with perfect balance. The officer added, "You'll be flying it solo." Of course, no crew available. She expected that. ATA pilots always flew alone. But alone in this giant felt different. Like stepping into the chest of a sleeping lion and hoping it didn't wake angry. She climbed the ladder with steady hands, though her heart moved unsteadily in her chest. The cockpit felt cavernous compared to the cramped fighters she was used to. Dozens of switches. 4 throttles instead of 1. A sea of gauges. It was less a cockpit and more a command center. Mary took a long breath and touched the worn metal of the control yoke. The faint scent of oil, sweat, and cold air filled her lungs. She opened her notebook, flipping through the diagrams she had carefully sketched. Position of the magnetos. The order of throttle advance. The way the bomber liked to tip slightly on takeoff. She studied every line one last time. Then she powered the engines. One by one, they roared awake. The ground vibrated beneath her. The cockpit shook gently, as if the plane were stretching its wings after a long sleep. The sound was immense, a rolling thunder that pressed against her ribs. She pushed back, a flicker of panic. She throttled forward. The Lancaster lumbered onto the runway, slow and deliberate. Mary felt its weight through her bones. She pushed the throttles in unison, coaxing the engines to full power. The wind howled against the canopy. The bomber gathered speed, resisting gravity with the stubbornness of a mountain. "Come on," she whispered. At last, the wheels lifted. The Lancaster climbed, heavy but powerful. Mary felt every second of the ascent in her muscles. She monitored each engine relentlessly, her eyes darting across gauges in a precise rhythm. The sky opened around her. Below, England shrank to a map of fields and hedgerows. Above, the sunlight faded into an overcast gray that stretched far across the horizon. She held her course, gripping the controls with both hands. Even in steady air, the bomber responded with sluggish weight. It didn't trust her yet. Halfway to Waddington, the fog arrived. It came without warning. A rolling white sea swallowing the landscape. Mary's breath caught. The horizon vanished. The world became a blank page. She focused entirely on her instruments, feeling the Lancaster tremble as gusts of wind slipped under its wings. Her altitude dipped slightly. She corrected. The engines hummed in deep harmony. She swallowed hard. Flying blind in a small plane was terrifying. In a Lancaster, it was something else entirely. She felt the ghost of fear brush her skin. She remembered the bomber's reputation. Tail heavy. Difficult in low visibility. A tendency to slip if mishandled. She tightened her grip. The fog deepened, pressing against the windows. She couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Pressure built in her chest, slowly rising like an unseen tide. She breathed through it, steady and slow, as she had taught herself since her near-fatal crash in the Wellington. Focus on what you can control. But then she heard the sound. A distant, rolling thump. She froze. Another thump. A subtle vibration traveled through the cockpit. She scanned the gauges. Engine 3 showed a slight drop in RPM. Not much, but enough to ignite dread. Not now. Not in this fog. She tapped the gauge lightly. The vibration grew. She adjusted the mixture and throttle, coaxing the engine to stabilize. For a moment, the sound evened out. Relief teased her. Then the engine sputtered again. Fear, sharp and cold, crawled through her limbs. Losing an engine on a heavy bomber was dangerous. Losing one in dense fog was lethal. Losing one alone, with no crew to help, bordered on impossible. Her mind raced. She adjusted the propeller pitch, then the fuel feed. The engine coughed once more, then finally settled. A thin line of sweat traced down her spine. She forced herself to breathe. A voice from her memory whispered. Amy Johnson, one of the ATA's brightest stars, dead 2 years earlier after losing control in a snowstorm. Mary had admired her courage, her fame, her pioneering spirit. Her loss had shaken the entire ATA. Even now, the darkness of that memory haunted the pilots who flew alone. Mary closed her eyes briefly. Not me, not today. She pushed the Lancaster forward, through the fog, maintaining altitude by instinct and instrument. Minutes felt like hours. The bomber felt heavier with each passing breath. She sensed the engines, the air pressure, the faint tremors running through the wings. After 30 agonizing minutes, the fog thinned. Sunlight pierced the gray. The shadow of the earth returned beneath her. And there it was, Waddington Airfield. A long stretch of runway glinting faintly in the pale afternoon light. A sight so beautiful, she nearly cried. But she wasn't safe yet. The landing remained. Mary steadied the bomber. She lowered the flaps. The Lancaster responded slowly, as if resisting descent. Her muscles tightened as she guided the bomber toward the runway. The wind pressed against the fuselage, nudging it sideways. She corrected. Another gust. Another correction. Come on, come on. The bomber descended too quickly. She fought against the drop. Then, too slowly, she nudged it down. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. The wheels hit the ground hard. The Lancaster bounced. For a second, it threatened to tilt dangerously. Mary reacted instantly, pushing forward slightly, then pulling back with gentle precision. The second touchdown held. The bomber rolled down the runway. Engines rumbling until it finally slowed, then stopped. Silence. Mary's hands fell from the yoke. She realized she had been holding her breath. She inhaled shakily, the cold air burning her lungs. Her entire body trembled with exhaustion. When she climbed out, a small crowd had already gathered. Mechanics, officers, ground crew. They stared at her as though she had stepped out of a myth. One officer walked forward. His expression was a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You ferried a Lancaster through that fog?" She nodded quietly. "Alone?" She nodded again. He shook his head slowly. "Incredible. Absolutely incredible." Another mechanic inspected the engines and whistled. "Engine 3 nearly gave out," he said. "A few more minutes, and it might have failed completely." Mary swallowed. She didn't want to imagine it. Later, as she sat at a wooden table sipping hot tea, she overheard two men talking outside. "That's Mary Ellis. The girl who flies anything. The one who ferried more fighters than most of us have flown in combat." Girl. The word should have annoyed her. But tonight, she felt only tired. A commander entered the room. He placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. She expected another assignment, but his face was softer than usual. "Not an assignment, Miss Ellis," he said. "A commendation. For bravery. For exceptional service." Mary glanced at it. The words blurred slightly. She blinked, fighting the unexpected sting in her eyes. She had never asked for recognition. Never expected it. She flew because she had to. Because the war needed her. Because the sky, for all its cruelty, had become a part of her. But the acknowledgement warmed something inside her. Something she thought the Wellington crash had broken. In the following months, she continued to ferry aircraft. Fighters, bombers, trainers, whatever the war required. She watched the tide slowly shift. More respect from commanders. More trust from crews. More understanding from the public that women were not merely filling roles. They were shaping the outcome of the war itself. Yet even as the war inched toward its end, loss never stopped. Beds in the ATA barracks still emptied without warning. Memorial services were whispered affairs, quiet and brief. The world outside barely noticed. But Mary noticed. She remembered every name. By the time the war finally ended, she had delivered over 1,000 aircraft. A number that seemed impossible. A number no one else matched. She had flown through storms, engine failures, hostile skies, darkness, grief, and the constant shadow of death. And she survived. Years later, long after the ATA had disbanded, and the world had moved on, Mary stood at an air show. A Spitfire roared overhead, its Merlin engine singing the same fierce song she once knew so well. The crowd gasped with admiration. But she didn't gasp. She remembered. The cold mornings. The silent fear. The engines that tried to kill her. The women who never returned. The sky that both threatened and saved her. A young pilot approached her, unaware of who she was. "Beautiful plane, isn't it?" Mary smiled. "Yes. It always was." He glanced at her. "Ever flown one?" Her eyes softened with quiet pride and lingering sorrow. "Once or twice," she said. He laughed lightly, thinking she was joking. Mary looked back at the sky, watching the Spitfire carve a perfect arc through the clouds. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, the longing, the memory of freedom and danger intertwined. The pilot beside her followed her gaze. "Quite a machine," he said. Mary nodded. "Quite a time," she whispered. And for the first time in years, she let herself feel it fully. The magnitude of what she had done. The lives she had touched. The war she had carried on her shoulders without ever firing a single shot. The world had forgotten many things about the Air Transport Auxiliary. But the sky remembered. The planes remembered. And Mary Ellis, the woman who flew through storms, through doubt, through fire, through everything a war could throw at her, remembered too. Her story wasn't written in textbooks or medals. It was written in the sky itself.